Facepalm America. I'm Beowulf Rockland. FacepalmAmerica.com is where you can get more information about the show, listen to past episodes, and connect with us on social media. 50 years ago this year, the Endangered Species Act was passed. It, for my generation, has served as the background of so many environmental struggles and fights over the years. It seems like it has always been around, but it got here and it has evolved over the course of its existence in a very particular and a very important set of ways. And I think we need to discuss it because the fate of our natural environment and our endangered species could depend on it. We're speaking today with Lowell Baier. He is the author of the Codex of the Endangered Species Act, the first 50 years, Volume 1. It's a history of the Act. Mr. Baier has been an advisor to every successive presidential administration since George H.W. Bush and has been an active and instrumental member of several national conservation groups. Lowell Baier, welcome to Facepalm America. Thank you so much for being here today.
I look forward to our discussion.
So, I know that you are thoroughly immersed in this, but for folks like myself who didn't live through it, what were the circumstances in the early 1970s that led to the passage of the Endangered Species Act?
The extent of extinction of species had been accelerating. The first act was a very small act that was passed in 1966. It was amended in 1969. And the trajectory of extinctions of both animals as well as plants was increasingly rising. And so the Congress, the public and the Congress took recognition of this problem and began to deal with it. The prominent species in the 72 and 73 period that led up to the enactment of the 73 Act were whales, especially right whales, elephants in our own country, condors, grizzly bears, polar bears, and a variety of species were notable, especially to the public. And they began to speak out about this. Now, this was the period that the 60s and 70s, you must appreciate, we're in a period of environmental awareness that this country has never seen before. And it was really paying attention to what was going on in the world and in our country. And so that's what prompted the Congress to enact the Endangered Species Act and make it far broader and more extensive than it had been in the two earlier acts.
I know that there were a lot of efforts at that time to preserve the environment, and addressing endangered species in particular is one way of doing that, and an important way of doing that, even for species that might not be, how shall I put it, telegenic or cute or easily relatable to human beings in their everyday lives. It was certainly important, as I perceive it and as I understand it, to get public buy-in through the idea that a certain relatable species of mammal might no longer exist, but it went far beyond that. Was there a particular reason that the act was framed in the way that it was around particular endangered species, or the way that it was structured, the way it was, and as a result, was it more successful because of that?
That is a very probing question. The big controversy and the major controversy during the period of 72 and 73, when the Congress was debating this, was who was going to have priority and be making the final decision. Who had priority? Was it the states or the federal government? and that was a great dialogue going on for 2 years. And the way it finally was resolved is the federal government would make all decisions. They had total primacy over what species would be declared endangered or threatened.
Okay, so how was that administered specifically, and how were those individual decisions made through the federal government?
Well, the responsibility for administering and enforcing the Endangered Species Act was by Congress designated to be under the umbrella of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Agency for most species, and for marine mammals, the Commerce Department had a section called the National Marine Fisheries Program, and they handled marine mammals.
It's interesting that it was sort of divided up that way. You could see the possibility for sort of being at cross purposes, given the fact that it was divided that way. Did that end up with any difficulties as far as the implementation, either early in the ESA's existence or later on in its history?
Well, as the Congress and many in the Congress predicted, and the people, the testimony during the hearings repeatedly said, this is not going to work. It should be one agency or the other. Mm-hmm. And it's really not proper to have it a split authority that has caused problems then and now. That has caused problems then and now, and continues to cause some problems. They pretty well worked out the levels of the boundaries and of jurisdiction. However, it was a very heated issue throughout 72 and 73 when they were debating the act. Okay. People said it was not going to work, and they were correct.
Okay. So once the Endangered Species Act was passed, how did the courts interpret how far it should go?
The first major case was TVA v. Hill. That was in 1978. The act was passed in 73. There was a lawsuit that worked its way up through the judicial system and finally got to the desk of the Supreme Court in 1978. And the Supreme Court took a very narrow view in their interpretation of the act. And they said it applies to all species, plants and animals, both. And it doesn't matter whether it's a grasshopper, an insect, a butterfly, a buffalo, or a mountain lion, or a fish. It applies to all living organisms, period. That surprised a lot of people. And the soundbite initially by the press was that, and the Congress was, we thought it only applied to megafauna, large species like polar bears and grizzly bears. And the court said, no, this is a very narrowly interpreted law and applies to everything. So that was the first major, how shall I say it, the first major surprise that came after the act was passed.
Was that the reason, or one of the reasons, that the Endangered Species Act became so publicly controversial in the 1980s and 1990s with fights over species like the coho salmon, the spotted owl, etc.?
Yes, absolutely. There was I call it a dark mythology that was born in the minds of the public, and especially Westerners, after the 78 court decision. And they struggled, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has struggled with this. Now, let me back up. Mm-hmm. When I really looked at this, now I'm 80, I'll be 84 in January. I started practicing law 10 years before the Endangered Species Act was passed, right here in Washington, D.C., right, where I continue to practice. Now, I knew all of the people that wrote the law and then later administered the law. I knew them all. And there are three still, thank God, three still alive that were part of the original group. That was a period of very a mentality in Washington of command and control following World War II. During World War II, the country adopted and had to adopt a very command and control approach to doing business, especially with World War II on the plate of the public. And that command and control mentality continued on for many years. All of the men that wrote the Endangered Species Act were war veterans. And likewise, the men in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the men and women that were then charged with implementing the act and applying and enforcing the act were also all veterans. So it was very disciplined approach by these folks once the act was passed, and it was supported then by the Supreme Court, who said this is absolute, ironclad. There's no outs. There's no wiggle room here. If it's an endangered plant or an animal or an insect, as designated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, it shall be.
Right.
And so that's sort of a long answer to your question, but it came from that command and control concept and mentality that really was alive and well here in Washington. And I was part of that. I came here and started practicing law 10 years before the final Act 73 was passed. And I knew John Dingell very well, who not only wrote the 66 Act, the 69 Act, but was the prime mover and champion of the final 73 Act. And he was a war veteran, as were many of his folks. I had been in the military 8 years in the Army, both active as well as reserve. And so I finally understood, and it was right in front of me the whole time when I did my research, that it was a command and control it was then verbalized by the Supreme Court when they wrote the 78 decision. Where the controversy came from is because it was absolute. You couldn't argue with the federal government, period.
And you're saying then that top-down command and control approach set up the Endangered Species Act and its implementation for a lot of conflict with agricultural, landowning, ranching business interests who would have to follow that law.
Yes.
Gotcha.
And the attitude of the federal government did not change until Bill Clinton was elected president. He was the first one since Truman, actually since FDR, he was the first president that had not seen military duty. The last one that hadn't seen it was FDR. And all the presidents in between had seen active duty during the war. So when Clinton came aboard, Bruce Babbitt was his Secretary of Interior, and in taking a look at the controversy of the Endangered Species Act and the log jams that it created, finally recognized that we could not continue with that same mentality of command and control. And he's the one with what he called his 10-point plan that came and introduced